Could the whisper of a single disgruntled citizen, motivated by avarice or fear, condemn a senator to exile, confiscate a wealthy merchant's entire fortune, or even trigger the downfall of a prominent family within the Eternal City? In the heart of ancient Rome, where the shadow of the Forum lengthened across stone and the murmur of thousands blended with the clang of artisans' hammers, such an outcome was not only possible but a recurring brutal reality. The Roman Republic, and later the Empire, possessed a peculiar mechanism for both justice and political expediency: the delator, a professional informer. These individuals, often despised yet undeniably powerful, stood at the nexus of law, politics, and personal vendetta, their clandestine dealings with magistrates and emperors shaping the very fabric of Roman society and its investigations into alleged crimes against the state or its citizens. How could a system, ostensibly built on law and order, allow such a figure to wield such immense, often unchecked influence, transforming private grudges into public spectacles of ruin? The roots of the delator system stretched deep into the Republic's formative years, long before the Caesars. Rome, unlike many modern states, lacked a professional police force dedicated to investigating all manner of crimes. While public officials known as vigiles patrolled the streets, their primary duties lay in firefighting and maintaining public order, not in meticulous detective work. Criminal prosecution, particularly for serious offenses like treason, pisoisosinna majestas, extortion, repetundai, or electoral bribery, ambitus, largely relied on private initiative. Any Roman citizen of good standing, quisque civis, had the right, and in some cases the civic expectation, to bring an accusation, accusatio, against another before a magistrate or a standing court. Quaestio perpetua. This was not merely a right, it was a societal function, a cornerstone of their legal framework. A citizen, known as the accusator, would present evidence, engage in legal arguments, and press for conviction. The incentives for such an arduous undertaking were often more profound than simple civic duty. Consider the bustling morning scene in the Roman Forum, perhaps during the 1st century BCE. The air, thick with the scent of roasted chickpeas, dust, and human exertion, hummed with activity. Hawkers cried their wares, politicians declaimed from the rostra, and beneath the colonnades of the basilicas, legal scholars and litigants huddled. Gaius Vibius, a man of modest means but keen ambition, might have been observed moving through this throng, his eyes scanning for familiar faces, his ears attuned to gossip and whispers. He was not a senator nor a knight, but a delator in the making. His current target, a wealthy provincial governor recently returned to Rome, suspected of egregious corruption during his tenure in Achaia. Vibius had spent weeks, perhaps months, gathering fragments of information. An indignant merchant's complaint overheard in a tavern, a disgruntled former slave's tale of lavish gifts accepted by the governor, even rumors of exorbitant interest rates charged on loans to struggling Greek cities. His motivation was clear: the prospect of reward. Roman law, in its practical wisdom, or perhaps its cynical pragmatism, understood that civic virtue alone might not suffice to motivate men to prosecute powerful offenders. Thus, a system of financial incentives was established. For certain crimes, particularly those involving financial malfeasance like extortion, the successful accusator could claim a significant portion, often 1/4, sometimes even 1/3, of the convicted party's confiscated assets, or a fixed reward. Premium. From the state treasury. This was not a trifling sum. It could elevate a man like Vibius from obscurity to comfortable prosperity, granting him social mobility that birth alone could not. Imagine the allure. A small, ill-gotten sum from a corrupt official could mean a lifetime of security for oneself and one's family, perhaps even the purchase of a small villa in the Sabine Hills. This prospect transformed the act of informing from a mere duty into a lucrative, if perilous, profession. The line between public-spirited citizen and opportunistic mercenary blurred considerably. The process typically began with a formal notification, nominis delatio, to a competent magistrate such as a praetor. Vibius, having meticulously documented his findings, would approach the praetor Peregrinus, the magistrate responsible for cases involving non-citizens, as the governor's alleged victims were provincials. He would present his libellus, a written statement outlining the charges and naming the accused. The praetor, seated on his ivory curule chair, would listen, his face impassive. This initial step was crucial. It determined whether the accusation had enough merit to proceed to a formal trial, quaestio. If the praetor accepted the delatio, the accuser would then be required to swear an oath, a solemn act intended to deter frivolous or malicious prosecution, though it did not always succeed. The stakes were high for both parties. If the accuser failed to secure a conviction, he could face penalties for calumny, including financial fines, infamy, infamia, or even, in more severe cases, corporal punishment. This legal jeopardy acted as a counterbalance, theoretically preventing a deluge of baseless accusations. Yet it also meant that a delator had to be cunning, resourceful, and utterly convinced of their target's guilt, or at least their ability to convince a jury of it. The very term delator itself underwent a semantic shift over centuries. Initially, it merely meant informer in a neutral sense, one who reports or points out. However, by the late Republic and especially into the Empire, it acquired a pejorative connotation, evoking images of greed, treachery, and a willingness to exploit the legal system for personal gain. This dual perception is one of the complex facets of their role. On one hand, delatores were essential for upholding public accountability, particularly against powerful officials who might otherwise escape scrutiny. They acted as a kind of informal, decentralized investigative arm of the state, rooting out corruption and subversion. On the other hand, their methods often involve surveillance, infiltration of private circles, and the cultivation of disgruntled associates, breeding an atmosphere of suspicion and fear. How many private conversations in the triclinium, the Roman dining room, were tempered by the unspoken worry that a servant or even a guest might be listening, ready to report a careless remark to a delator. This pervasive anxiety fundamentally altered the nature of social interaction among the Roman elite, turning trust into a luxury few could afford. One prominent school of thought among modern historians, exemplified by scholars like A.H.M. Jones, suggests that the delator system, for all its flaws, provided a necessary check on the power of the senatorial aristocracy, particularly in the provinces. Governors, often far from Rome's oversight, possessed immense authority and many opportunities for self-enrichment. Without citizens willing to bring charges and pursue them vigorously, many injustices might have gone unpunished, undermining Roman rule and exacerbating resentment among conquered peoples. These historians view the financial reward not as an inherently corrupting influence, but as a pragmatic tool to encourage civic participation in the administration of justice. The public nature of the trials held in the open forum allowed the populace to witness justice being done, reinforcing the legitimacy of Roman law, at least in theory. This perspective paints delatores as, at times, unsung agents of accountability, even if their motives were less than purely altruistic. However, another significant school of thought, championed by figures such as Tacitus in his historical accounts and echoed by modern scholars like Robin Seeger, paints a far darker picture. They argue that while the system might have had noble intentions, its execution often devolved into outright abuse, particularly under the emperors. For Tacitus, writing of the reigns of Tiberius and Domitian delatores were not just opportunistic. They were instruments of tyranny, their greed weaponized by despotic rulers to eliminate political rivals and seize fortunes. The fear they engendered became a primary tool of social control, stifling dissent and fostering a climate of paranoia where no one felt truly safe. This view emphasizes the chilling effect on freedom of speech and political expression. A single overheard complaint about the emperor's policies, a casual critique of a magistrate, or even a perceived slight could be twisted into a charge of maestas treason, the most serious offense imaginable, punishable by death and the confiscation of all property. The difference between a legitimate complaint and a malicious fabrication often rested on the whims of a magistrate or the emperor himself. turning the scales of justice into a precarious seesaw of power. The shadow of the delator thus extended far beyond the courtroom, touching every aspect of public and private life, constantly reminding Romans of the fragility of their liberties and the omnipresent reach of the state. It raises a haunting question. How deeply did this fear permeate the very foundations of Roman trust? And what did it cost the soul of the Republic, and later, the Empire? The reign of Emperor Tiberius, beginning in the 1st century CE, stands as a particularly stark period for the burgeoning power of the delatores. Moving from the relatively open legal landscape of the late Republic, where accusatores still operated within established questiones perpetuae, standing courts, the early Principate saw a shift towards a more centralized and often arbitrary system of justice. Tiberius, a ruler known for his suspicion and reclusiveness, utilized the delatores not merely as instruments of justice, but as direct extensions of his imperial will. The crime of maiesta, treason, which in Republican times typically pertained to specific acts against the Roman people or their dignity, was broadened dramatically under Tiberius to include virtually any slight, spoken or perceived, against the emperor himself, his family, or even his statues. This expansion created a fertile ground for ambitious delatores, transforming their role from public accusers to quasi-imperial agents, the clandestine investigators and prosecutors of imperial disloyalty. Imagine the atmosphere in Rome during those years. The once vibrant public spaces, still bustling, now carried an undercurrent of tension. In the senatorial chambers, debates became muted, their vigor replaced by cautious circumspection. Citizens meeting in the porticos or the baths would speak in hushed tones, carefully choosing their words, lest a casual remark about the price of grain or a perceived delay in imperial decrees be misconstrued. The delatores themselves often lacked the high social standing of the senatorial elite, yet they possessed a terrifying power derived directly from the emperor's favor. They were not elected officials, nor did they hold formal magistracies. Their authority flowed from their direct access to the imperial court and their willingness to prosecute maiestas. This symbiotic relationship was deadly. The emperor gained a means to suppress opposition without direct involvement, while the delatores gained immense wealth and influence, often at the expense of their victims' lives and reputations. One such man was Gnaeus Domitius Afer, a celebrated orator and a formidable delator of the early Principate. His career, documented by Tacitus, illustrates the professionalization of the role and the sophisticated methods employed. Afer would not merely react to rumors, he would actively cultivate sources, often among the household slaves or disgruntled clients of prominent senators. He understood the nuances of Roman law, the art of rhetorical persuasion, and the subtle currents of imperial politics. His investigations were not haphazard, they were calculated campaigns. He would identify a target, perhaps a senator known to hold Republican sympathies, or a wealthy equestrian whose assets might prove appealing to the imperial treasury. Then, patiently, he would begin to construct a case, piecing together seemingly innocuous statements or actions, twisting them into evidence of maiestas. He might, for example, gather testimony from a slave who overheard his master lamenting the decay of republican virtues, interpreting this as a direct insult to the Principate. The handler, in this imperial context, was not a single magistrate, but the emperor himself, or more often his most trusted confidants, like the infamous Sejanus during Tiberius's early reign. Sejanus, the ambitious praetorian prefect, masterfully manipulated the delatores to eliminate rivals and consolidate his own power. He provided them with information, promised imperial protection, and ensured swift convictions. The rewards were immense, not just a share of the confiscated property, but often public recognition, grants of land, and even elevation to the equestrian order for successful delatores. This created a powerful incentive structure, turning Rome into a vast, intricate web of surveillance and suspicion. The scene might unfold in the hushed opulence of a villa on the Palatine Hill, where Sejanus, reclining on a couch, would discreetly nod approval as Afer presented a detailed dossier on a senator, perhaps a scion of an ancient family, whose very name was perceived as a challenge to imperial authority. The air would be thick with the scent of incense and political intrigue, the only sound the rustle of papyrus and the low conspiratorial voices. The consequences for Roman society were profound and devastating. The culture of fear stifled intellectual discourse and political freedom. Men of talent and integrity often withdrew from public life, fearing that any prominence would make them a target. The Senate, once a powerful deliberative body, became a subservient rubber stamp, its members reduced to competitive flattery of the emperor and denunciation of their peers. Public trust eroded, not only between citizens and the state, but among citizens themselves. Friends became wary of friends, family members of each other, as the pursuit of wealth and power through delatio became an irresistible temptation for some. Tacitus vividly describes how these informers became the plague of Rome, their presence a constant reminder of the fragility of life and fortune. The very word delator became synonymous with calumniator and sycophant, a figure reviled yet simultaneously feared and courted. Historians grapple with the question of whether this surge in delation was a direct result of imperial manipulation, or if it merely amplified a pre-existing Roman inclination for legalistic disputes and private prosecution. One perspective suggests that while emperors like Tiberius and Domitian certainly exploited the system for their own ends, the underlying cultural framework, which encouraged citizens to actively participate in justice for reward, already contained the seeds of abuse. The Roman legal tradition, with its emphasis on formal accusation and public trial, inadvertently created a loophole that malevolent individuals and ambitious rulers could exploit. Thus, the delatores were not an anomaly, but an extreme manifestation of inherent characteristics within the Roman legal and social structure, pushed to their monstrous limits by autocratic power. The insatiable desire for wealth, combined with the shifting legal landscape and the emperor's overarching authority, coalesced to create this period of intense fear and denunciation. Conversely, another viewpoint emphasizes the active role of the emperors in shaping the phenomenon. Scholars like F.H.B. Dale argue that the delator was not merely an opportunist, but became an almost official, albeit unsavory, agent of imperial policy. The incentives were deliberately amplified, the scope of maestas deliberately broadened, and the consequences for failure on the delator's part deliberately lessened or ignored when it suited the emperor. This suggests a more active, calculated strategy by the imperial regime to dismantle potential opposition and consolidate power through terror. The delatores, this view, were less products of an evolving legal system and more instruments forged in the crucible of absolute power. Their existence a testament to the systematic erosion of republican freedoms under the Principate. Regardless of the exact balance between systemic inclination and imperial design, the ultimate outcome was a society gripped by a pervasive and debilitating fear, where justice often became a mere pretext for political assassination and wealth redistribution.